Okay, and in this video what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how changes in the money supply affect interest rates and the different elements of aggregate demand that are affected. So again, what we're not trying to do is explain the mechanism yet. What we are trying to do is to explain how changes in one variable change the other. Again, not how, but trying to get the causation from a change in one to a change in another. Okay, so what we're looking at now is that when enacting monetary policy, the central bank, which is can be in charge of the money supply for a country or region, what are they doing? They're changing the money supply in order to change interest rates, in order to change aggregate demand, in order to achieve an economic objective, usually stable inflation or low and stable unemployment. Okay, well, this works in three ways. Again, I have to stress, I'm not explaining how this works, I'm telling you that it works this way. We will look at that in later videos. So, if the central bank prints more money, that is an increase in the money supply. All right, now, banks have more money to lend out. So how do banks make money? Well, they make money on lending it out. That's how they make their profit. So if now, because more money exists in the economy, and then let's just make the simplifying assumption that the central bank gives it to commercial banks, the banks that you and I deal with on a day-to-day basis, well, now these commercial banks have more money to lend out. Now, if they have more money to lend out, they have to do something to the price of borrowing this money in order to incentivize people to borrow this extra cash so that they can make the new profit on this extra cash the central bank has given them. So basically what they have to do in order to incentivize people to borrow more, they have to lower the interest rate. Now, a good question, I suppose, is what is the definition of an interest rate? And this is the definition that you will write down in your IB exam. It is the price of credit or borrowed money. Okay, that's what the interest rate is. Well, what element of aggregate demand is affected by this? Well, many. So let's talk about the first one. The interest rate falls, and again, why? Because the central bank has given these commercial banks more money. They now have more money to lend out. They need to incentivize people to borrow this extra money, so they have to lower the interest rate. That is the effect on interest rates of an increase in the money supply. And I want you to understand why. Because commercial banks, the banks that you and I deal with on a day-to-day basis, will never be dealing with the central bank, all right, are profit maximizers. They want to make as much profit as possible. That means they want to lend out all the money that they have available to lend out. And if the central bank gives them more money, they have to incentivize people to borrow this extra money, and they do that by lowering the interest rate. And the definition of the interest rate is still up on the right-hand side, the price of credit or the price of borrowed money. Another thing to keep in mind is it is also the reward to savings, and that is very important for this slide. So the interest rate falls. With a lower interest rate, the reward to savings falls. If you put your money in the bank account and it's a savings account, fine, right? And then what happens is you were getting 10% and now you're getting 0.2%, which is the case in many Eurozone countries. You're not going to bother saving this. I mean, it's not that you won't, but at the very least, you'll reduce the amount that you save. Okay, so if you're not saving your money, well, what are you going to do? You're going to save less and spend more, which is number 5. That reduction in saving, and as such an increase in consumption, causes consumption to increase. Another thing is now, with this lower interest rate, credit card payments, things like that are also cheaper. So you may be inclined, or at least more people will be inclined to borrow more for consumption purposes. You may max out your credit card that you wouldn't have done when the interest rate on these credit cards were higher. So consumers also borrow more for consumption purposes. So a reduction in saving causes consumption to increase, an increase in borrowing for consumption purposes causes consumption to increase, and as such, aggregate demand rises as a result of this increased consumption. Now let's get the interest rate definition out of the way and let's have a look at what aggregate demand is. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Well, as a result of the reduced interest rates caused by increasing the money supply, Consumption has increased. Now, assuming a ceteris paribus relationship, which we will relax in the next 2 slides, if nothing else stays the same, if nothing else changes, aggregate demand has to rise because consumption has risen as a result of the increase in money supply, and therefore that increase in money supply has caused the interest rates to fall. If you don't understand that, just go back to the start of this slide. Okay, now that's how consumption is affected. Well, how is investment affected? Well, the central bank prints more money. Banks have more money to lend out. They want to make a profit on this extra money, but they can't force anybody to borrow it, so they have to incentivize people to borrow this extra money. Well, how do they incentivize people? Well, they lower the interest rate. What's the interest rate? The price of credit or borrowed money. Let's not forget that now, okay? So with the lowered interest rate, the cost of borrowing falls. We've said that for consumption. Now we're talking about investment. Now, if your costs fall, which cost of borrowing is the cost of investment in many cases, well, more investment opportunities are now profitable. Because assuming the revenue that you would have gotten from building, let's say, 200 apartments stays the same, which there's no reason it wouldn't, okay, with a lower cost of borrowing, a lower interest rate, now more of these investment opportunities are now profitable because your cost has fallen and, ceteris paribus, so your revenues remain the same. Now, if more of these investment opportunities are profitable, well, more businesses will engage in investment opportunities, and as such, the amount of money spent on capital investment also increases. As a result of investment increasing, aggregate demand also rises. So let's get that definition out of the way of interest rates, and let's relook at or revise our definition of aggregate demand. Because of the increase in the money supply, causing banks to lower their interest rate in order to incentivize people to borrow more, firms are also borrowing more. Not just consumers are spending more and saving less and borrowing more for consumption purposes, but firms, businesses now are more inclined to engage in investment projects because the cost of them has fallen, and as such their profitability has risen. So consumption has increased, and also investment has increased. Now, we really should know that from previous videos, but if not, that's fine at the moment. So the other thing now to talk about is G. That's not affected by monetary policy. That's usually affected by fiscal, well, it is affected by fiscal policy, but we're going to look at X minus M, which is net exports. Now, this is something that I'm not going to go too far into. I will cover that more in the next total unit, which is the global economy. But right now, I just want you to be aware of how interest rates affect exchange rates. Now, how did the central bank cause interest rates to lower? Right, well, they printed more money. Now, if they printed more money, banks have more money to lend out. Some of this money, and this is just a very cursory explanation, not like in depth, some of this money will end up on foreign exchange markets, otherwise known as the Forex market. All right. If some of this newly printed money ends up on the Forex market, that means that the supply of the domestic currency will increase on the Forex market. That means that the domestic currency is less scarce. When something is less scarce or an outward shift in the supply curve, the price, and in terms of price of money, the value of that money will fall. Now, if the value of the domestic currency falls, that means domestically produced goods on international markets are more competitive. Their prices are cheaper in terms of other countries' currencies than they were before, because the value of that currency is now worth less. Okay, so if €1 buys $1 and the value of the dollar falls to, let's say, 80 cents, American exports are a lot cheaper to Europeans. So most likely that will cause exports to increase. Also, if the domestic currency has fallen in value, well, then imports are more expensive. We have to give more of our currency to get the same amount of the foreign currency. So imports will fall and exports will rise. Both of those, as a result of printing more money, causing the supply of the money on the foreign exchange market to increase, causing a devaluing of the currency, particularly if it's intentional, that causes imports to fall, exports to rise, and as such, net exports rises. Aggregate demand, therefore, rises as a result of this monetary policy, which was expansionary, which is printing more money. If aggregate demand rises, we've got, well, let's have a look at it again. C has risen, I has risen, this has fallen. All of this as a result of printing more money by the central bank. Now again, there's methods, there's tools, we'll look at those in later videos. I just want you to understand the causation. So let's have a look at this now. Effect on aggregate demand when the central bank prints more money. On this axis we have the price level. Okay, that's measuring inflation. On this axis, we have the real GDP. That's measuring total real output. What I'm going to do first is put the long run aggregate supply, then the aggregate demand curve, and then the short run aggregate supply curve. I hope that you would see that equilibrium in the short run is here, and fiscal and monetary policy are short run demand side policies. So where's the equilibrium? Well, it is below the full employment output, which is here. There is a recessionary gap between Y1 all the way to the L or AS. Okay, so that's the situation now. Well, how can the central bank try and fix that in theory? Well, the first thing it can do is print more money. When it prints more money, okay, the interest rate falls because banks have to have extra money to lend out. They're profit maximizers. They make their profit by lending out. So they have to incentivize other people to borrow from them. That means that they have to lower the interest rate. When they lower the interest rate, the reward to savings falls. So people do less of it. Savings falls. And also consumption rises. So C rises. And as a result of that, aggregate demand rises. On the I or investment front, the cost of borrowing falls, more investment opportunities are now profitable, firms are profit maximizers, so they will therefore engage in those newly profitable ventures, causing investment to rise. If investment rises, this also causes aggregate demand to rise. Now, finally, with an increased supply of the currency finding its way into the Forex market, okay, the currency devalues, particularly if it's intentionally from the central bank. That causes net exports to rise. Exports rise because our domestically produced goods are now cheaper to foreigners, and imports fall because foreign produced goods are now relatively more expensive to us in the domestic economy. And that again causes aggregate demand to rise. Now, all of those three, consumption rising, investment rising, net export rising, combined with the multiplier effect, the aggregate demand curve should shift outwards, hopefully to here. And then we have a new short and long run equilibrium at a higher level of inflation or price level. This will be inflationary, but we have closed this recessionary gap between Y1 and YFE. Now, I really hope that makes sense. I hope there's nothing in that confuses you. Particularly about the currency stuff, don't worry about that until we get to the next unit. And my advice is to watch it a few times until you do understand it. I hope that helps, and thanks very much.